Hi everyone, it's Ellen, and today I want to share with you my favorite books so far of 2019. So I've really been slacking this year on my reading wrap-ups. My goal is to get those started again. So to kind of make up for that, I am making one video to tell you all of my favorite books so far from January until now, June. And then we'll start from now on doing my reading wrap-ups again. I do have a Goodreads page if you are interested in following along with books that I read on there. Those will have all the books, not just my favorite ones, and I'll put that link in the description box below the video. For read alouds this year, my favorite have been Harry Potter 5 and Harry Potter 6. We are working on 7, so I'm sure that'll be part of my July reading wrap-up, but for now, Harry Potter 5 and 6 were our favorite read alouds of the year. When I was in middle school and high school, I only was able to read up until book 4. Then I ended up going to college and got busy with college coursework and never finished the rest of the series. So I'm glad to be able to share that with my children now. My first favorite of the year was Still Life with Rice by Haley Lee. And I read this book as part of a homeschool book club that we started out here in South Korea. And we wanted a book that had something to do with Korean culture, and one of the members of the book club suggested this and absolutely loved it. So it's a memoir, and it centers around a girl who is South Korean born but ends up moving to the United States around 4 or 6 years old, and then grows up around her mother and her grandmother, who eventually moves out there. Doesn't really understand much about their history until she goes back to South Korea and meets more of her family, and through her family learns more about her grandmother's history, and comes back to the United States and interviews her grandmother to learn more about her history growing up in South Korea. She was in North Korea. She ends up going to China for a certain time during the Japanese occupation, and then ends up selling opioids up there, comes back down to to North Korea. Then the war breaks out and she comes to South Korea. So it was just a really interesting, not only looking at her life, but just what life was like back then in South Korea and in North Korea. And you know, that's a part of history that we don't really learn about in American schools. So I really enjoyed this book, and it was just a different way to see what life was like back then. My next favorite book of the year was also along the lines of Korean culture and history. The Girl with 7 Names, a North Korean's defector story. And this one was about a girl who grew up in North Korea and then ends up leaving, and through her time in North Korea and then spending some time in China and then South Korea and America, she goes through 7 names. And this was a really interesting view into the life and the culture of North Korea. Again, something that we don't really learn much about in schools in America. So now that I live in South Korea, I'm taking the time to learn more about the culture and the history here. This one was really interesting, and through her story, I learned more about like the education system in North Korea and how they brainwash them into believing that their country is number one. I think all countries do this to a certain extent, but you understand, you have a deeper look into it with this book and kind of follow along with her journey on how she tries to escape North Korea. At first it was more by accident, but then she does end up trying to go back and get her mother and her brother and family members. But very interesting book. Again, if you're interested in Korean culture or history or life, this is also a good book to read. My next favorite book was not my usual genre. I decided to just try it out on a whim and I ended up loving it. But it is Every Breath by Nicholas Sparks. It is a love story. It's about a woman who goes and rents a beach house in, I think it was North Carolina, and she ends up finding someone there, falling in love, and but she is about to get married, or she thinks she's about to get married, and she is kind of torn between who does she pick, the man that she's been with, what's comfortable, what she knows, or this new man who is actually from Zimbabwe and was only there on vacation for a short period of time. So she kind of has to pick and choose between the two. I liked how the story unraveled, and and maybe I was just in the mood for a romantic book at the time. But I did enjoy this book, and if you are in the mood for a romantic book, this is definitely one to pick up. The next book that I read this year that was definitely one of my favorites was Becoming by Michelle Obama. And I have always liked the Obamas and definitely have loved Michelle, but reading this book I felt like a closer connection with her, understanding more of her story, her history, how she met Barack and how they got together, and just the story of their lives, and just understanding what being in the White House is like from the First Lady's perspective. I really loved understanding and reading about her history, how she met Barack, how they got married, and just their lives together, sacrifices she had to make as a working mother and then as First Lady. I just really, some parts of the book really resonated with me, and I really enjoyed learning more about her life story, and definitely on my recommended list. My next favorite for the year was The Tattooist of Auschwitz, and this one was a really good story. It is based on a true story. This book centers around Leo and his experience in Auschwitz as a tattooist. So he is the person who tattoos the numbers on the arms, and just his fight for survival. He ends up finding someone in the prison camp and falls in love with her and makes a promise to her that they will stay together and be together after they get out of the prison camp. So it's his experience in the camps, his fight for survival, different people he encounters. I like this book because it really made you think, you know, if you were in that position, what would you do? You know, there's a certain amount of, you know, survival, you want to survive. There's also a certain amount of having to do things and put up things that you normally wouldn't in another situation. And it's, you know, do you put up that fight, or do you just succumb to your situation and you just do what you can to survive? So I really enjoyed this book. Definitely recommend this one as well. My last favorite this year is Rabbit, the Autobiography of Miss Pat. And this is a story about a comedian, and I actually hadn't heard of her before this book. And this is the story of her upbringing. Basically, Miss Pat was one of 5 children who was growing up in a cycle of alcohol abuse and poverty, petty crimes. She was 13 when she had her first child, and then 15 when she had her second. She told stories of her upbringing, just many examples of just what it was like growing up being poor in a black neighborhood. And there was one particular story where she was telling she was so poor she had no money. She was trying to feed her 3-month-old child, and ends up taking ketchup, putting it on some bread, chewing it up and feeding it to her daughter because that's all that she had. She found ways to hustle and make some money. She ends up selling crack and just finding different ways to get by, to provide for her children. She does find help along the way. She finds some mentors that kind of help her and try to guide her along the way. Now she is a successful comedian, so the story does end on a brighter note. This book was an interesting insight into America's margins, you know, what life is like at the bottom, and just knowing that those conditions exist in America is really disheartening, but it is true and it's a reality. I think this is a great book for people to read who come from privilege, to understand that these types of lives are in existence today in America. And it was really a story of determination and resilience, and I would highly recommend this book to everyone. Those were my favorite books from January to June this year. Have you read any of these books? What are your favorite books that you've read so far this year? Please let me know in the comments down below. Please like and subscribe to stay up to date on our videos. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.